This is all about diversity and healthy ecology, so I'll throw in another accent for you. If you can imagine getting on a horse and going for a quick canter, that's what I'd like to do today, it's more of a big picture background, picking up on the context that Alan Savory so well set up. But my message is a very simple one. We develop healthy soils and the other landscape functions and healthy food from that. I believe, and I hope I'll show you, that regenerative agriculture in its different forms has the best solutions to both our planetary crisis and our human health crisis. So that's got to be one hell of a story. So we've got some technical issues, so if you don't mind me, I'll just be indicating next, thanks. So just quickly, won't bore you with my story. We manage temperate grasslands, southern tablelands in New South Wales, mainly fine wool, and we've sometimes cattle if we have to mulch down bulk in a holistic grazing system, obviously based on Alan's work. And nearly a quarter of the farm now is down to conservation reserves for biodiverse function. Thank you. Next one. It's a fine wool sheep with famous Kelpie dogs. Thanks. We have over 140 bird species now and some very rare reptiles. That one's an endangered species down the bottom. Thank you. And some of these things you don't get over here. And the echidna on the bottom is one of 3 species of a unique genus in the biological world, the monotremes, egg-laying mammals. And the more we're improving our grasslands, the more ants we're getting, the more we're getting of those, what you would call anteaters. Thanks. We also have the privilege of working with what American Indians would call a medicine man. This is a senior lawman, and our Indigenous people have over 60,000 years now of landscape management, and I feel I'm in kindergarten the more I'm working with this guy, so that's a great privilege. Thank you. So as I said, the message is pretty simple. If we develop healthy landscapes, truly functioning, diverse, from that comes healthy food and fibre, and it does deliver healthy profits because we're eliminating huge costs in industrial chemicals, etc., and increasing numbers when it's done well, but also healthy people and a healthy planet. Thanks. And so I'm not going to go into the different forms of regenerative agriculture. It's all about regenerating those landscape functions. But simply what regenerative agriculture is about, and Alan was alluding to complexity, complex systems, holistic thinking. If you look at the modern thinking on complex adaptive systems, a key component of that is the idea of if we enable Mother Nature and her systems, she will self-organise back to health using characteristics within the systems that are called emergent properties. And that's a hugely exciting idea to me, that we can enable her. And it's that old story which we were discussing last night, Alan and a few of us, that the more you get into this complexity and holism, actually the more simple the solutions become. Thank you. So really, my book is using the broad principles, such as the 4 landscape functions that Alan and others talk about, but then lots of stories to illustrate that and extrapolating into some of the bigger pictures. And I use the word regeneration because it's open-ended. The word sustainable now is so overused, it feels a bit like just marking time and static. So that's why this word regeneration is so important. Thanks. So, as you can see, those rats are discovering they're not in the most comfortable position. And sadly, that's really the situation of both ourselves and our sustaining planet. And it's called the Anthropocene because there's one species, us, that's now destabilised this extraordinary Earth that is maintained by 9 self-organising systems. Thank you. So there it is, blue-green planet on the left. There's only one that we know of, not just in the solar system, but wider. It's blue-green because it was life itself that created conditions for life. About 3.2 billion years ago, bacteria first put oxygen up into the atmosphere. And when the great forests got going, Over 400 years ago, the carbon dioxide cycle began to regulate. If you look on the right, there's now one of those species of life that has now destabilised this extraordinary planet. And I'm arguing very strongly what we're now going into makes world wars even look like storms in teacups. This is the greatest crisis our species has ever confronted. But there are some solutions, which is my argument. Thanks. What's behind the post-1950s move into the Anthropocene? It's what we now, a range of scientists across the spectrum, social, biophysical, call the Great Acceleration, which is that from the 1950s onward, all the major trends you want to look at, whether it's the orange, the sort of social economic, rise of population, rise of GDP, rise of use of resources, if you like, increasing number of McDonald's restaurants, all show that exponential rise. And same with the biophysical trends on the right, whether it's all the different chemicals going into the atmosphere, ocean acidification due to too much carbon dioxide, what's happening to the fish stocks in the world, they're all doing the same thing, the Great Acceleration, that exponential rise. Thanks. And if you look, as we'll discuss later, the human health, modern human health diseases, they parallel that. The Aral Sea was once the fourth largest freshwater lake in the world, 270 miles by 180 miles. Industrial agriculture, post-Second World War, did that. We are a powerful species when we set our minds to it, particularly in things like desertification, as Alan pointed out. Thanks. I happened to spend time in 2013 in the dry zone of Burma, Myanmar. They won't argue about climate change. Look at that photo on the right. They had this beautiful village, structured community with grazing and a few vegetables. Had had 20 years of climate change by then. The monsoons had totally destabilised off the Indian Ocean. They've now turned their landscapes into pretty much desert with a few thorny scrubs. And what's exciting now, as a result of that visit, we now have the Savoury Institute starting to work in there with one of their hubs, and they've trained over in the Zimbabwe Savoury Centre. Thank you. So I'm not going to get into it, but this is what's behind the Anthropocene. There's 9 key Earth systems all interacting, not just that thin envelope that protects us, the ozone hole. Climate change, biodiversity loss. We humans have now triggered the 6th greatest extinction event this Earth's ever seen. But this time it's our fault. Land system change, etc. If you look at the scientific literature, industrial agriculture, if it's not the key player, is a major player in destabilising those systems. Can't avoid that conclusion. Thanks. There's a flip side to that. So if industrial agriculture is a major or the key cause of that destabilisation, a different healing regenerative agriculture can turn that around, and that's what I'm arguing. Thank you. So how do we get into our mess? And you'll notice I've put a hyphen between agri and culture. Because as one farmer said, it all comes down to this 1 square foot of real estate between our ears, the paradigms and the worldviews that we carry, some of which go back 10,000 years, such as use of the plough. And so that's what it really comes down to. As anyone who's done holistic or other training, it's about paradigms, worldview shifts. Thanks. And as Alan pointed out earlier, agriculture evolved, Western agriculture in that fertile crescent of the Middle East, Syria, Iran, Iraq, etc. Beautiful, healthy, spongy, diverse grasslands where the first weedy plants, cereals, were domesticated, as were sheep and goats. A lot of the Mediterranean was forested, and rich, fertile river valleys. And within 2,000 years, we now have evidence in Iran, 2,000 years of domestication of damage already occurring. And here's Plato back 360 BC complaining about deforestation around the hills around Athens, which he complained were like the skeleton of a sick man, all the fat and soft earth having been wasted away. As you all know, that's still going on. What I will ask you now is to look at that area today. Syria, Iran, Iraq, Libya, top of Africa, the Sahel, Chad, all desert. constant drought, constant social conflict. That's the story of agriculture and our mindsets and our metaphors going back right to the first plough. Thanks. And without getting into the details, and it's not until I spoke to that old Aboriginal elder that I got a vision of what our landscapes in Australia were like pre-white settlement, pre-1820. We had a hugely functional small water cycle. Go for a ride on a horse, you were soaked even in midsummer from the knees down from the heavy mists and fogs. Spongy grasslands, chains of ponds, watercourses. That's all gone. And so what the first process of desertification does is destroy that small water cycle, that process of transpiration and dews, etc., that comes out of the spongy ground and the diversity and the ground cover. Thank you. So then you ask yourself, do these sort of land practices preserve a small water cycle? No, that's part of the problem of what's left of our small water cycles is destroyed by these sorts of activities, bearing the ground, poisoning it, or putting on industrial fertilisers that also poison the biology. Thank you. Many of the fertilisers anyway. And without getting into the heavy philosophy, it was sort of alluded to a bit by Alan. If you look at on the left, those two pictures of an Australian Aboriginal society pre-white settlement, or Bruegel the Elder's painting of peasants at harvest in Europe. Their worldview was that they were not separate to Earth. They were indivisible with Mother Earth. Their religious cycles, the whole process of their culture embedded them within Mother Earth. In a way, it was an early form of holistic, truly holistic thinking. And then we went through that extraordinary phase in European civilization from the Renaissance, scientific revolution, industrial revolution, capitalist revolution, to the modern capitalist revolution of economic rationalism, endless growth, endless destruction. So it's wonderful stuff in that process, but the net result was that at the end, we now see ourselves largely as a society and civilization as separate to Mother Earth. Earth is a substrate from which we extract profits, not something that if we damage her, we damage ourselves. That is a huge shift in the mind of our civilization. And that's really what is behind the damage that agriculture has done and is doing. Thanks. And so when that mind hit the new continents, like Australia, America, parts of Africa, South America, that was the result. No understanding of Mother Earth. Because when Australia was settled, we were part of the industrial empire of Britain. We had to export our products, and that was the result. That's from the top down as the amount of soil we lost just in that one event. Millions of tonnes went east to New Zealand. Thanks. That photo on the left is of a recent dust storm, a bit over a month ago, coming into cities in Victoria, Australia. It's still happening. And bottom on the right is about 4 years ago, a similar dust storm. So it's still happening in Australia. This mechanical mindset. Thanks. And when Roosevelt reacted to Dust Bowl, he made his famous statement that a nation that destroys its soils destroys itself. And gee, is that evident now in what's happening in the Mississippi Basin, etc. And the records now show that agriculture, out of land available for agriculture across the world, which pretty much was what Alan was showing, globally we've destroyed or degraded nearly 40% of it. It's a pretty frightening performance. It shows you how powerful we are with the wrong mindsets. Thank you. Okay, negative story out of the way. There is another pathway. And the key is healthy, biologically rich and active soil and all the other landscape functions that go with it, which is pretty much what these 2 days are about. Thank you. And so really, plants with animals, I emphasise that, can restore our farms, soils, ecosystems and profits. I'm not talking about monocultures, not talking about the plough, nor industrial inputs. But multi-species cover crops, richly diverse grasslands and animals grazing and impacting within those systems. I will give one example later in really impossible soils where the animals may not be used, their products still are in compost, etc., to trigger those processes. Thanks. So when I reflect on my own mistake-ridden journey as a farmer, I had to take over a farm when I was 22. My father got ill, and I sought the best advice, which was industrial, and then walked into a 5-year drought and destroyed a lot of our land and ended up with a big debt. When I look back on that naive manager, I see someone who had no ecological literacy. I couldn't read how a landscape functioned, what its key elements were. And I think this is integral to this movement, that we have to understand how landscape functions. Thanks. Because our current model is that. That picture on the left was a full-page advertisement, A3, in our rural papers a few years ago, for Roundup. You can see the drum with the sexy eyelids, sexy smile. The language in that ad says, "Trust your killer instincts." So that's really how the big end of town is pushing it. We've got to control and effectively destroy. Thank you. Thanks. And so that was really where I ended up, under this training of a good modern farmer. I could drive past that landscape on the right, which was once mixed forest with healthy grassland. I could drive past that in that early phase of my management and not realise it should have been in hospital in intensive care. It is that ill. And that's just purely a lack of ecological literacy, not being able to read what's there. Thanks. So, in having to teach masters and other students, you can really simplify ecological literacy down to these elements, which Alan Savory well and truly has written about, the first four, the biophysical ones, in his books, since he first wrote Holistic Management. We won't go into the details, but obviously everything comes from the solar cycle, photosynthesis, sugars into the ground, into the plants, which then starts to drive the biology, and the water cycle improves. And with that comes biodiversity, as we've just heard in the previous session. To round it out, I've added the fifth element, that group of white species there on the right, because it's that foot of real estate. Whatever we do will interact with those other four. And if you look at the intersection of the arrows in the other four, if you destabilise one, it's going to have knock-on effects to all the others. If you start to regenerate one, they're all indivisibly impacted as well. And it's really this which undergirds all ecosystems and human civilization. Thanks. So I'm just going to skip through those now with a few examples. I see my manager of a landscape is having my ground covered 100% of the year and having as much green on it as I can, pumping in the sugars for as long as I can throughout the year. That's simplified my role in managing those few thousand acres, because that's what drives the whole process. Thanks. And really this was Alan Savory's great insight, that we have this template from nature. Why are those grasslands, under all those millions of animals and that huge animal impact, so healthy? And I'm sure that was the question you then took, Alan, to asking how can we use this? You know, we now think that in the bottom end of Canada, North America, top end of Mexico, probably up to 80 million bison as well. We're grazing in that country. And you can see the top right, I've just put that artistic representation of wildebeest to get that idea of energy and impact. Thank you. So out of that came the principles of holistic management that have now gone worldwide. This is one of Alan Savory's early clients. I was privileged to stay with Norman Kroon, who sadly just died. When he started in the late 70s, that country was all desert, like the paddock on the right. Norman had told me he had to walk 1 kilometre to find a perennial plant. We're talking about land that had been belted for 400 years by the Dutch and the English, and country that would have had rivers with hippopotami in it. Within a few years of holistic grazing, using those principles, the transformations occurred on the left. And now I understand there's at least 3 times more production. You can see how absorbent the land is, how diverse it is, deeper rooted shrubs and more perennials, etc. Thank you. An example in Australia, the wet tropics, way up North Queensland, same story. 100 years. By the way, these red arrows, it's the same tree in those two photos, the benchmark photo. 100 years of overgrazing, set stocking, too much burning. You can imagine a big tropical rain, most of the water goes off, nutrients into the barrier reef. Within 10 years of shifting to holistic grazing, the diversity comes, shrubs, trees, plants, etc. And that active gully erosion, which was vertical and active, has started to heal, and recently the owner, she told me that they've now got eucalypt seedlings throughout that gully. Thank you. It's quite remarkable when you apply Mother's solutions. And as we're hearing at this conference and witnessing now across the world in different continents, this movement in multi-species cover cropping is doing the same thing, but when it works best, you've still got holistic grazing driving through the system. So it's where grazing and cropping are combined, where each are mutually beneficial to give that synergy. Thank you. So cropping uses diverse crops and plants. I'm telling a lot of people here to suck eggs, you know this better than I am. Creates mulch, controls weeds, improves soil health. It covers that ground, protects the damage of the sun, and I'll show you why in a minute why that's important. But it seems that the best results, we do need those animals mulching that down, their dung, their urine, the humates and all those sort of things that comes from that process. Thanks. So these are pretty remarkable creatures. If you look at the history books in Australia, so many academics say that the worst damage to Australian environment are the cloven hooves of the animals. It's not their hooves, it's their badly managed mouths. So we have a wonderful fertiliser machine. We have their rumens that when you have, after dry time, will re-inoculate the soil with microbes, etc. They're fantastic mowers, and their feet, when well managed, are great massagers. So they're actually an extraordinary tool. Thank you. And so by using high density, holistically grazed livestock in cropping and grazing, we can eliminate industrial inputs. It's being done now, and to even better performance than traditionally, and the elimination of huge costs. You get your spongy absorbent soils, you're protecting your soil. And we now know from the microbiologists in both this cropping and the grazing, and this story was recently connected, we know the reason for that tipping point, that takeoff point, what is called quorum sensing, where you get this extraordinary communication, plants, microbes, etc., fungi, and then in time even into the human gut that triggers switching on and off of genes. It's quite a remarkable scientific story behind these remarkable pictures that I'm showing you. And so that's why we can get really rapid soil building. Thanks. And I did mention one example. Here at this conference, Jerome and Melanie Klompy, they've got really wet clay soils, and it's very difficult to have high impact grazing in those situations. But by using animal manure from dairies, etc., composting it to get rid of the nasties, you still have a ruminant input into that system. Thank you. So we go to the water cycle, because you get the solar cycle working, everything else knocks into place. And again, this is one of the savoury clients. That blue arrow is the same point in that same landscape, but 27 years apart. So here we have on the left, like the Queensland example, overgrazing, mismanagement, in that case probably hundreds of years. You can imagine all the water pouring off that, no absorption. And then the swing over to an ecological, holistic approach. You can see the diversity, the solar cycle working, and I would say there'd be 10,000 times more water in that landscape on the right. Thanks. And so what we're finding in Australia and America and South America, by having short-rooted cereals, a lot of tillage, is this extraordinary hard pan on tens of millions of hectares worldwide now. No diverse roots, no perennials, no forbs. On the left, that's what's happening, as opposed to what's happening on the right, a no-till field or a healthy grassland where you've got penetration of the soil, carbon matter going in, channels for the water to go, and then all your creatures creating bugs, etc. And the importance of cover is so crucial. On really bare soil, you get a violent rainstorm, splash erosion will deliver more compaction than tillage. So there's so many reasons for having cover, as well as protecting the microbes in that soil. In Australia, we're now getting temperatures in the cropping zone over 40 degrees. You get a 40-degree temperature on bare ground, half a centimetre down, you've got 65-degree temperatures from a baking effect. No microbes will survive in that. So ground cover is so critical. Thanks. And as this American graphic depicts so well, the root of the matter is infiltration. So that orange line is the hard pan now. No water going down. None of those variety of roots, all doing different things, contributing to quorum sensing, and no life. And it is a huge shift to increasing desertification. Thanks. And so function number 3, the soil mineral cycle. I mean, it's really the guts of it in many ways, isn't it? It's what much of this conference is about. That soil food web, that whole diversity underneath the ground. Thanks. It's encouraging to see that last graphics coming out of the United Nations. At least some of the areas are doing things in that area. But soil microbes and other soil life are sustained by that photosynthesis cycle and that diversity of roots. And 93% of non-plant organisms are stuff we can't see. That's probably why we've ignored them. And so I won't go through the basics that you know, that we need that more and more of that photosynthesis, putting those sugars and exudates in to feed the whole cycle. Thanks. So that's the soil food web. You would have all seen Elaine Ingham's version of that. Thanks. I mean, I sat through, when I went back and did a PhD in my late 50s, I sat through a soil course 40 years after I'd done my first one. Still no mention of biology. It was all physics and chemistry. And that's pretty much what happens, at least in Australia at the moment. What's the importance? One of the key things we talk about are the root fungi, the mycorrhizal fungi. There's a few different varieties. They have a bargain with the plants. Plants give them the exudates, the sugars. They're part of the symbiotic bargain is to go off and source all the nutrients, or most of the nutrients, micronutrients, minerals, which goes into healthy food. Plant on the left is from an industrial system, sprayed, fertilised, chemical. Mycorrhizal fungi doesn't like that. On the right, if you have a healthy cubic metre of soil, it can be up to 25,000 kilometres of the invisible hyphae out there working to get the nutrients. Spray, fertilise, aggressively plough, that's all gone. And you end up with monocultural, modern industrial cropping plants waiting for their drug fix of NPK, etc. So it's just a huge contrast in the two different approaches. And as Wes Jackson, a great thinker in America on regenerative agriculture, says, the ploughshare may well have destroyed more options for future generations than the sword, which those statistics I showed you and what Alan was talking about pretty much emphasises. It is both the ploughshare and overgrazing, particularly maybe overgrazing, are unbelievably damaging to our civilisations. Thank you. At least those 20 that have gone. And then we get these remarkable sort of farmers. As Alan said, it's bottom up. I call it an underground revolution playing on the soil. We don't need top-down policy to drive it. The driving has come from the bottom. The policy in that can follow, in my view. These guys farm on 3.8 billion-year-old soil. It's basically beach sand. In the last 10 years, when the Western Australian cropping belt, tens of millions of hectares gone into massive debt, these guys have grown a business from 600 to 25,000 hectares. It's so profitable. They've eliminated all industrial inputs. They've modified modern machinery. They're combining vermijuice, worm juice, with compost extract as they plant their cereals and canola and wrap it around that. And they are now getting yields 120, 140% better than the industrial neighbours, but they've eliminated 90-something% of their cost. And there's a number of these lateral thinking revolutions that have come up across the world, of which multi-species covers is just yet one more. Thank you. And so I'm not going to overkill the story on multi-species pasture and cover cropping. Multi-species pasture cropping evolved in Australia as drilling cereals into the summer active, the C4 grasses, as they go dormant in the autumn, and then harvesting a crop in summer as the C4s wake up. But multi-species cover cropping is obviously done not necessarily in native grasslands, but the two are doing the same thing in effect. Thanks. And you all would be aware of this guy, one of the key leaders working with people in Australia, and I'm looking forward to hearing one of the leaders in soil in America who's working with Gabe, who's here today, Jay Fura. So it's a combination of farmer innovation working with sympathetic people in the Department of Agriculture and elsewhere. And he's doing remarkable things in really tough country, North Dakota. Thank you. And this is just an example of the impact. That shovel, the soil underneath is Gabe's after 12 years of shifting to multi-species cover cropping, which animals got to go through the system. You can see the aggregation on the earthworms. The clod of soil on top is 40 metres away over a fence, the neighbour's traditional industrial farming, which was what Gabe's was 12 years ago. I imagine if you had a penetrometer, Gabe's would be about 100, 150 psi. You'd probably break the penetrometer on the traditional soil. And rainfall penetration, Gabe now is getting his first inch will go in 9 seconds, his second inch, 16 seconds. Where he was 12 years ago, like his neighbour, the first inch takes 2 hours to penetrate, as you can see from that clod. So it's quite remarkable stuff once you get biology, etc. working. Thank you. And so really what I'm also talking about is the key to all this is this soil organic carbon, the making of those beautiful chemicals like glomalin and all the other stuff, the long-lasting carbon that has to come from biology. As you can see, the glomalin glue in that middle photo grown on that beach sand. Thanks. And just quickly, we now know that if you get this high soil organic carbon in and the right animal density, we get this triggering, this take-off point in the soil of rapid soil building because we've allowed Mother Nature to self-organise. Thanks. And just recently, the agricultural world is connected with the microbial biologists and starting to understand what this take-off is. And I won't go into it now, but it's called quorum sensing, and it's where plants communicate with the soil biology. They're not using Latin or English, they're using chemical language, proteins and hormones and stuff to trigger this tipping point and the switching on and off of genes. And what's really interesting, if we eat good food off those systems, genes in our microflora are switched on and off in a positive way. If you eat crap food, junk food, food with glyphosate in it, the negative will occur. So there's huge ramifications through this emerging knowledge. Thanks. And so just quickly, I'll finish these key landscape functions with the biodiversity or dynamic ecosystem communities, whatever you want to call it. It's all the same. But as we've heard, people using margins for wildflowers to preserve predatory insects and pollinators and all that. If you simplify a system, it's a huge cost in what nature does to control disease and all the rest of it. Thank you. And just one quick example, a good agroforestry operation, which in Australia was pioneered by a group of farmers that said, let's have a forestry driven by farmers for forestry, for farmers. Not monocultures of pines, but trees that fit into our productive landscape. And so this guy and his family, by the way, that's the same strainer posts in both photos. Where they're leaning there is the same strainer posts, 24 years apart. So 1994, this farm had got down to only 2% of tree cover and vegetation. And the wheels were falling off. They were getting dryland salinity, they were getting a lot more disease, their lambings and calvings were dropping. 24 years later, then, you can see with the ripping, they'd put 20% of the farm back into trees. We analyse the results now. Their overall income, even with 20% out, is up 25, 30%, but they've stacked in another 6 or 7 enterprises. both forestry, beekeeping, what's called bush foods, cut flowers, etc. Thanks. And that's one of the enterprises, that dam at the start. It had a lot of salt, a lot of weeds. And his wife said, well, let's just fence it off. 2 or 3 acres won't hurt. Let's put all these beautiful native flowers. That's now a $50,000 enterprise selling cut native flowers into restaurants on the surf coast around Melbourne. So by getting that diversity, social and ecological complexity, diversity, resilience comes into the system. Thanks. And Europeans, you don't need us to give any lectures, and I notice there's talks later on today on agroforestry or silvopastoral systems, tree food forests like these cork oaks, which you can crop and graze through and stack in 6 or 7 enterprises. Thanks. So that's the background on the landscape functions. I'll quickly just address the Anthropocene issue and some of the solutions that we hold collectively. Thank you. So that's that slide I showed you before. Yep, industrial ag causes a lot of the problems. The flip side is regenerative ag has fantastic solutions for that. Thank you. And a couple of years ago, this guy, Paul Hawken, probably one of the world's leading social and environmental thinkers for the last 3-4 decades, he got sick of asking the climate scientists, what do we do about it? They said, well, that's not our area. We're crunching the numbers on chemistry. So he commissioned 80 scientists and analysts to come up with the best 100 methods to pull down carbon dioxide or prevent its release. They fully costed 80. I've got to know Paul and working with him. And I looked at his top 20 or 30 and I said, there's 7 or 8 regen methods all there, all doing the same thing. Let's call them regenerative agriculture. Then let's look at the numbers. And the numbers then tell us that by 240%, nearly 2.5 times better than the next best method, regen ag is the best approach to pulling down carbon, which I think Alan alluded to earlier. And that is an incredibly exciting message that lies within our hands. Thanks. And just recently in Australia, the first carbon credits under the UN Paris Climate Agreement was granted to these, again, another farmer innovator, modified a machine a bit, grazes animals holistically, and he's now been awarded this credits, and you can see the 2 control and what he calls his soil key approach on the right. He's turning light soil into dark soil within 2 years and making 0.9% carbon, fixing that within 1 year. It's quite extraordinary. He's triggered that quorum sensing. Thanks. And then finally, these big issues are human ill health. Totally connected if you think about those great acceleration issues. Thanks. And it's no accident that if you look at those great acceleration pictures, that the modern health diseases are doing the same because they are intimately connected. What we've done to our soils and the other landscape functions and the food directly impacts on the health disease issue. And so I would say very strongly, there's a lot of evidence now, a lot of scientific publications, that industrial agriculture destroys food nutrient availability, diversity and quality, and it delivers man-made poisons into our industrial foods. We now know that from all the testing. Thanks. And that's the background, won't go into it, but as a modern hominid species, we evolved for 1 million years in the African savannas. Indigenous women going off after the food and the medicinal plants. Like most of them can identify over 500 species. The men hunting, they weren't just hunting meat. They were hunting animals that are grazed on grasses and shrubs that have up to tens of thousands of phytochemicals in them, tannins, phenols, terpenes, etc. We've evolved to detect and use, for our immune system and physiological function, that range of nutrients and micronutrients. We exclude them from our diet at huge cost. Thanks. You've probably seen that. If it wasn't so sad, it's quite funny. But and you could nearly imagine the symbol that goes on the milkshake container. Thanks. There are dozens and dozens of papers now showing that post-1950, as we move to industrial breeding of crops, so dwarf wheats just focused on production and response to inputs, and just focused on that, there's been a huge cost. Those originally adapted plants and then the killing of the soil with the inputs has led to a crash across the Western world and now increasingly the developing world in a lot of our key minerals, nutrients and micronutrients. Plenty of studies. This is 63 wheat cultivars, the soft whites, the bread wheats that were studied. Yes, grain yield goes up under the dwarfs, but nutrients have crashed. And a lot of them are crucial nutrients to physiology and immune system. Thanks. And UK Ministry of Agriculture given a study, number of studies just in vegetables, 1940 to 91. This is one of many studies now, scientific papers across the world. You know, copper, calcium, iron, magnesium, potassium, all dropping for the reasons I've explained. Same trends in meat, dairy, horticulture, and dozens of other papers. Thanks. So the causes of declines in our nutrients, over-processing of food. If you look at a white good on a shelf that can last a year, it's been so stripped of nutrients, you wouldn't even feed it to your chooks. Genetic modification, we know that you can't play around with complex genomics without a cost. But most of the decline in nutrients is related to a serious decline in soil health and soil carbon. We are eating nutrient-poor foods. Thanks. But this is the other big one. It's silent spring number 2. And it's our vulnerability to glyphosate. 1 million tonnes now going out around the world every year. And the evidence is just mounting and mounting. Thanks. So it was mentioned, I think, by Paul in the previous session. This is the elephant in the room. But it's becoming a pretty big elephant we can't ignore. Thanks. There's plenty of good scientists. I've worked with Don Huber in his 80s now, widely respected across the spectrum in soils. Hundreds of papers. He can give a 2-day seminar non-stop just on the impact of glyphosate on the complexity of soils. Bob Kramer used to be with ex-Department of Ag, not anymore obviously, but these guys can go on for days on the evidence that's now building on human, soil, plant, animal health of what glyphosate does. Thanks. Some studies show that, you apply it the wrong way, you'll kill half your earthworms. Thanks. But to summarise up a lot of that research, and there's dozens of papers, you can say that there's 2 key reasons why glyphosate is emerging, and I would argue as the worst and most pervasive chemical in our environment today. Most pervasive because it's so widely used. Interferes in a crucial amino acid production pathway in our microbiome of our gut. And that's the pathway that produces key hormones and amino acids for physiological and immune function. It chops off that pathway towards the end, rendering us more defenceless in our health function in the gut. And we now know it's water soluble, which means that it penetrates key barriers like the gut lining and the blood-brain barrier. Thank you. And possibly even sensitive barriers like the placental and embryonic one. Is it in our food and water? Yes, it's being found regularly now in industrial foods and waters. Thanks. So that's our second brain. It's nearly the same weight as our cerebral brain. It's these creatures we can't see, but glyphosate is having a hugely negative effect, including in the way they switch genes on and off. Thank you. So I won't go into it, but it's certainly impacting on the leaky gut syndrome, rendering some of the gatekeepers defenceless, allowing glyphosate into the bloodstream. Thank you. And same with the blood-brain barrier. So there's no accident. And there's a wonderful scientist talking here tomorrow at one of the sessions about some of the modern diseases connected to these sorts of functions. Thanks. Zach Bush, doctor in America, now has a team of PhDs and senior researchers. He got twigged to connection between autism particularly and and industrial chemicals, particularly glyphosate, but also nutrient-poor foods. And they're now showing that bacterial population patterns in the gut predict accurately, if you disturb that, many of the modern diseases. Not saying it's a single causal factor, but it's a key player. It's now emerging. Cancers, dementia, autism, the whole lot. All of those that are doing that parallel, great acceleration. Thanks. And epigenetics are now being affected, obviously, because it's the second main form of genetic inheritance, as you probably know. I mean, it was thought after Watson and Crick in the 50s that you had to have a mutation to change your DNA. No, genetic inheritance can come about not through changing the DNA, but the switching on and off of genes, and our environment does that. If we have a long co-evolved environment for gut health, we start changing that, you're starting to get epigenetic switching on and off that's undesirable. Thanks. So it's our choice. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying regenerative agriculture can help save the planet and ourselves. Big claim, but I'm prepared to defend it with a lot of research. Or, on the right, we can continue rolling the dice, which is what we're doing as our governments continue with inaction, particularly our Australian government. Thank you. And Hippocrates, who gave us the modern medical ethic, attributed to have said this nearly 2,500 years ago. Let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. And it's so true. Thanks. And don't go into the details, but we now have 4 major court cases ruled against Monsanto Bayer. I'd say Bayer is wondering about the due diligence of their lawyers now. Another 14,000 odd lined up with cases. The chances are glyphosate will be banned at some stage, maybe first here in the European community. That will be a shock to the system that could trigger more shift to regenerative agriculture, but I would say that is in the pipeline for sure. And rather than looking for more chemicals, many of which are a lot worse than glyphosate, we now know we have alternate solutions. Thanks. So I'm arguing yes, we profitably, regeneratively and healthily, we can, doing that, graze and farm without industrial chemicals. Yes, we can do that. We don't need them. It's being done by the best operators now and to even more profitable effect. Thanks. How do we do it? One paddock, one farm at a time. And that's now starting to get speed up across the world. Thanks. We've got to do it in partnership with our urban consumers. Small farms, urban gardens, community gardens, etc., etc. It's got to be a partnership. Thanks. And we have to do this. In Australia at the moment, surveys show that 9 and 10-year-old children, for every 1 hour of outdoor play, 7 or 8 hours in front of a screen. We are increasingly divorcing them from Mother Nature at the very time they should be learning we are indivisible from her. Thanks. We have to get them to wonder about nature rather than look at these damn screens. Thanks. Can we do it? Absolutely yes. As Charles Darwin said, it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It's the one that is the most adaptable to change. And we are right into that window now, an urgent window. We have to adapt and quickly, and the solutions you'll hear in the next 2 days are part of that process. Thanks. So I'll quickly wrap up. Thank you. Dramatic? Maybe. I happen to believe we are on the abyss as a planet and a species, standing right on the edge. Have maybe a few decades, and some of the climate scientists think we may not even have that. But we have a window now, we have to start turning it around. And in this room and these sort of conferences, the solutions are there. Thanks. So today's problems aren't going to be solved with today's mind. Gus Speth said that, a leading ecologist. We've got to change our mindscapes. Or as an old farmer said to me the other day, the thinking that got us in the shit won't get us out of the shit. Which is pretty well sums it up. Thanks. And we've got to overthrow that 10,000 years of agricultural tradition. As a young student, I did mountain climbing, and I was in the Himalayas in '78 and saw this guy. Now that is a 10,000-year-old. The plough itself isn't 10,000 year, but the first ploughs were like that. They were called the Ard. And he was ploughing on steep slopes. So that metaphor of ploughing and disturbance is very powerful in our species. And we're still doing it, still disturbing that soil. Thanks. So I'll put before you the law of the turtle. Behold the turtle, he makes progress only when he sticks his neck out. We've got to that stage before we get our heads cut off, basically. Thanks. And so Donald Worcester, a wonderful American environmental historian, laid down 3 principles for good farming, which I think are a pretty good philosophy. Making people healthier, promoting a just society, and preserving the earth and its network of life. Thanks. We have to combine the best of the mechanical, the best of science and that sort of thinking with that organic view if we're going to go ahead. It's not going to be one or the other. We have to have that new type of organic mind. Thanks. And so regenerative agriculture does have the profound solutions to the Anthropocene crisis. We have an agriculture that heals natural systems by enabling Mother Nature to self-organise. And we've got key solutions to the human health crisis. Thanks. And I'll finally leave you with this thought from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. The ultimate test of a moral society is the kind of world it leaves to its children. And I feel as a grandparent, I feel that responsibility incredibly strongly. But I think it's a good thought to go away with. So I'll leave it there. I don't know if we've got time, Paul, for questions, but I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Charles, thank you very much. My cheap gag about carbon footprint was rather misplaced because I think he's more than offset his carbon footprint by teaching us all today. Yeah, we've got time literally for 2 questions if we've got them. Roving Mike, any questions? Here's one.
I liked the photograph of your lawman setting fire to the ground. We're organic farmers, and I'd love to be able to do the same thing, but no one in this country will even discuss the issue, and it's not actually on the agenda. And over the next 2 days, it was banned for largely cosmetic reasons in the early 80s. It was an absolutely key ingredient in then encouraging conventional farmers to chuck on the chemicals. Can you talk a little bit about the place of burning in agriculture?
It's not a simple issue, as Alan, Xavier and I could have a good discussion on it. Australia's a bit unique. About 60% plus of our vegetation is adapted to fire and to chemicals in smoke. There's 20 odd that will trigger seed and propagule stimulation. If you burn at the right time, which the Indigenous people know how to do, which interestingly is usually late in the afternoon when you get the switch over in this photosynthesis cycle and you've got the right humidity and level, you're not doing severe damage, you're making a different carbon, you can have an incredible influence on regenerating, laying down some right carbon and regenerating soils and stuff. I'm not going to pretend to speak for your environment or an African or American environment, but I do know in Australia that tens of thousands of years of experience in skill burning can play a constructive role. The risk is you don't do it properly. There's a lot of carbon goes and you've bared the ground and caused damage. But I wouldn't risk wading into the issue that you've alluded to. But that's interesting what you're saying about it opened the gate for another replacement. I suspect you might have plants that are adapted to fire, but I can't comment on it. Sorry.
In these increasingly populated parts of the world, can you tell us at all what you think human feces can do to help rebuild organic matter and
human feces? Yeah. I think it's a huge one. It's interesting for all the faults that people extrapolated from him. In about 1867, Karl Marx talked about the metabolic rift. He was watching the industrialising of cities and the non-recycling of human waste, etc. And it has to be a key resource that is just being dumped into the ocean or wasted or whatever. So there are some models around the world where it's starting to be addressed. but it has to be a key role because you can't just keep using nutrients and then wasting them, so to speak. It should go back into the system. Not quite a closed loop, but it should have a key role. So I'm not going to argue with you on that being addressed. Thanks. Right.
Good.
Pretty
well
well
done.
Thanks.
Yeah. Charles will be signing. You are signing books, haven't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll be signing books in David's bookshop, which is in the shed next door, later on this afternoon. I would call his book